Yes, welcome. This is F Rap Critic. I'm your host, Boy Malik 16, founder and creator of Plates and Crates. And no, I didn't spill a bag of Fruit Loops on my chest. Shout out to everyone behind the Speaking in Tongues documentary, which is the official documentary covering the history of the legendary Native Tongues Collective. And it only makes sense that we are talking about the Native Tongues Collective. Clearly, this was a deliberate decision because today we're going to be reviewing an album by core members of that collective, straight off of our review of West Side Connection last episode. You might have noticed we're jumping again, jump straight from episode 11 to episode 12. I'll get back to the point 5 soon enough, but right now I'm hitting you in rapid succession as part of our 1996 for the rest of the year campaign, where I'm reviewing nothing but albums turning 25 until the new year. And I figured, we'll hit the other side of the spectrum and talk about a group consisting of 3 members that might just be 3 nicer guys than the members of West Side Connection. We're talking about none other than the 1996 classic album by De La Soul, Stakes is High. And if you have not already, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. This is going to be a very special episode dedicated to the memory of our little bro, Plates and Crates family member, and my Harlem homie. Just lost him recently. The bro Jordan Clare rocking his hat. And what makes this a special episode at one of our live events, which was our very first art gallery show with the Black Medallions crew. Shout out to them. They're members of this Speaking in Tongues movement too. Can't wait till this comes out to the world. But he just did an excellent homage to the whole crew. He did the greatest True Goy, Consequence, Mike G impression, and what makes it super memorable is that he's younger than the rest of us, and I remember him coming up to me and saying, "Yo, Malik, I don't know these songs. I've never heard these songs in my life." And I was like, you got this. And he's just such a professional and such a good all-around dude that he just embodied it and killed all his parts on all of these classic De La songs. So it just makes sense. It goes right in line with what we're talking about today. A little background on this album. This album was released in the summer of 1996 amongst a good amount of heavy hitters. And this is the first album not to feature production from their mentor and guiding production force, Prince Paul, the legendary Prince Paul. He was also at that event. Shout out to him. And it means that they were taking a turn into a new chapter in their careers, and we'll get into that. This is category 1, where we go over the product, the album itself. And if we're talking about production, then it makes sense that we jump right into the first dimension, quality of production, dimension 1. Now, if it wasn't Prince Paul, that tells you that we have new players on board. The new players are the group themselves. De La helms almost all of the production on this album, with the exception of one track where Spearhead X leads that and gets all the credit. And then you have the introduction of Jay Dilla into the Native Tongues fold before the Soulquarians, and that is where he makes his arrival on the title track, Stakes is High. Now, let's talk about Stakes is High. Stakes is High is a standout track, not just because of the lyrical content, but sonically, there's no other beat on this album like that. And sonically, there just wasn't many beats in this era that sounded like that. There was a crisp clack to the Jay Dilla drums that were used, the decision to use the Ahmad Jamal sample and the James Brown sample together. That bass line is just otherworldly, right? And we talk about the drum hits because this album is so quintessentially boom bap. That was the decision for the new direction that De La chose when they decided not to have Prince Paul production. As legend has it, Prince Paul did submit some beats in the early process of making this album, but the group decided not to use them because it didn't fit with the sound they were going for, and this sound is decidedly more aggressive and boom bap in your face, to the point where there's a good amount of songs on here where the melody doesn't even start until there's about a 4 to 8 bar lead in of just drum kicks and bass hits. And on the single The Business, where it's literally just drum and bass hits, and they even start the song off by saying and bass up track, because I want to hear that oomps oomps, and the beat is so simple that I remember in 1996 wondering, is this from an old 80s song? Because I'm like, is it possible to still have beat patterns that simple that no one had used already? And sure enough, this became such a popular underground staple that even KRS-One used it for the interludes on his album that came out the next year. And, the jazzy sensibilities and eclecticism and eccentric sampling that Prince Paul introduced to De La that made that kind of their calling card is still present on this album, in the decision, such things like the vocal chops, right? The decision to have that wail that comes in and out on Long Island Degrees that fades in and out. Woo! It's just random, right? There's jazziness all throughout. Beats like Down Syndrome, you get this horn that comes out of nowhere. Beats like Four More, where that's an undeniable jazz bass line that leads that track. And then, songs like Dog Eat Dog and Long Island Degrees, where there's this like reverberating, I don't think it's a Rhodes piano, but twinkly piano keys for sure on those two songs. They give it this beautiful quality, and those come in the middle. Lots of organ manipulation. There's manipulated organs in different ways on different songs, none as prominent as It's So Easy, where it sounds almost like bagpipes being manipulated at low tones, and another simple beat. So you get super simplified, stripped down beats, and no songs here really have more than like maybe 6 notes. It's really back and forth from super MCs to Big Brother beat, real simple melodies with just different sounds that are not really used a lot in hip hop, especially at that point. So there's interesting production here. There's some songs that are stronger than others because of the production. There's some songs that are just more subdued and maybe don't hit as hard. And there are some blatant direct samples here. The 2 samples, Then in It, which is the Spearhead X contribution, which samples the same song that Large Professor sampled for his single the following year, and the sample used on Baby, 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 Ooh Baby.
The Hobo Scratch sample, I believe,
is the name of it. And they make a joke about that, the Buffalo Girls sample, really. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. It's up to you to decide if that still has any timelessness to it, which takes us to dimension 2, which is the cohesiveness of the sonic bed. How well do all of these beats go together? So this album running the spectrum from really, unexpected samples, like I said, that organ that sounds like a bagpipe, and then there's beats on here where the boom bap is so much so in the lead that the melody is more of an accent than an actual melody. It's like, oh, it comes in and out when it needs to, just to remind you that this is a different beat. There seem to be tracks on here that are less inspired than others, and again, by the time Stakes is High comes in at the climax of the album, it thumps so hard that you kind of wish you had more beats like that, but it wouldn't have felt like an album without what you have in the middle. And so the album starts, at least the 4 first tracks are so boom bap heavy that you wonder if that's going to be the feel of the whole album. It's not until the middle of the album where you start getting more of the, either simplified or more beautifully complex beats like Long Island Degrees, with more of that jazzy sensibility. 4 More, and then you get those outright samples thrown in the mix, and then it comes back to boom bap. By the end of the album, it's just a mixed bag of everything you've heard so far, maybe not as well executed. There's a point where Baby, 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 Ooh Baby might feel out of place because it's so up-tempo and it's such a just full-out sample, but then when you realize what they're doing with it, it goes right in accordance with everything else, and plus it's a short song. So Something to consider on the scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 3, the question of, is there a definitive tone, mood, or theme to this album? And I would say yes. It sounds like the group made a deliberate decision to be anti what was going on in hip-hop at the time. This is the Jiggy era. There was a lot of glorification, a lot of use of these titles of player, Mac, gangster. We have gangster rap marrying into this commercialized era and being the most profitable form of hip-hop at this point. And not only were the guys, at least the rappers of the group, taking this stance where they were rebuking that style of hip-hop or denouncing it as not being hip-hop, but they were also taking an antagonistic stance. And I thought it was really interesting to choose to not just say, hey, we're not them, we're not that, but to actually challenge it and poke at it and confront it in a way that's like, try me. And Paz, his voice is more of the one blatantly doing that throughout the album. They both do it. So Trugoy and Paz both take that stance, but Paz, I think, goes more aggressively out of his way to draw the line in the sand, and I think he pokes the bear more. De La's always had this everyman element to their presentation. I think a lot of that may have something to do with why their star never really rose further than it has. They're always going to be legends. They're not forgettable rappers, but I do think people didn't look at De La as having star quality. And in a lot of ways, within the Native Tongues collective, it seems that A Tribe Called Quest outshined the rest of the groups in Native Tongues. So you would think it'd be the other way around because De La were kind of the predecessors. But here, there's almost a doubling down, mostly by Trugoy Plug 2 in the lines, whereas it seems like Paz wants to escape that a little, which is why he's taking more of a challenging and aggressive tone and really playing up lines about women. Trugoy Plug 2, Dave, it kind of seems like he's settling into what people think of him. He repeatedly says lines a couple times on the album where he mentions, I never had millions, maybe one day having that Rolex is the goal. Just kind of like a shrug. There's a vocal shrug that happens in a lot of Trugoy's verses on here, whereas Paz still seems like he has a fire and some ambition to not be what those other rappers are representing, but at least be in those places with them. And he laments on fame on one of the tracks. We'll talk about that in one of the other dimensions, maybe in the next category. But yeah, as far as tone, yeah, it is an anti yet antagonistic direction and feel to it, while also settling into this everyman space. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 4, the song distinction versus the repetition of words and sounds. Okay, if 90% of the production is being held by De La, like I said, you only get outside production from Spearhead X, who gives you the Din and It song, and Jay Dilla, who gives you Stakes is High as a co-producer, then, not a lot of, redundancy here. You're not getting the same kind of samples or the same kind of sounds. The organs are prominent, the jazz drums are prominent, the boom bap is prominent, but it doesn't saturate. It doesn't saturate any points of this album. What does happen though, this is a 16-song album. The skits are not individual tracks. The skits come on the tail ends or the beginnings of the songs. And so what that means is that for 16 songs, unfortunately, the guys here do not relent on their mission. Even on songs where they're directed, talking about life or talking about women, they still take a minute to take pot shots at the Jiggy era rappers, to remind you that they are not them. And even the most dedicated backpacking purist could get bogged down and tired of that sentiment for a 16 song album, and that is repeated. Other things that get repeated is Long Island. I don't think De La ever repped Long Island as much as they did on this album in different ways. There's at least 2 songs with Long Island in the title. Once again, Long Island and Long Island Degrees. And then Paz, Plug One, says the same line on Baby, 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 Ooh Baby, which is strong like the island I'm from, which was his ending line on his verse from The Business, which kind of takes away, because it was such a strong and cool ending line for that verse and that song, that to use it again, even though that's a short song, kind of felt like, okay. A lot of use of the term East Coast. Interesting that I'm doing this coverage of this album right after coverage of the West Side Connection album, because this is still smack dab in the middle of the East versus West, made up or real, however you want to see it, conflict that was going on. And De La either purposely or inadvertently bought into it, because only Paz, mentions East Coast multiple times throughout this album. For what reason, I don't know, because he doesn't diss the West. He makes one statement where he's like, like them West Coast guys who throw up signs, I hate a buster unless it's Busta Rhymes. But the need to distinctly mention East Coast multiple times seems to come from no other place except for, hey, I'm making my stance. There was this idea that you had to represent something in this era, and I think that's what's happening. So a lot of Long Island, a lot of East Coast, a lot of we're not them in the form of, shots and tongue-in-cheek lines. And something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, that takes us to dimension 5. The amount of content versus the amount of songs. So, De La is a group that's expected to speak on social issues, to speak on, topics in abstract ways or in, thought-provoking ways. And you get that, but I would say on this album, there's not a lot of direction for the content. The content exists, and sometimes the content is going to show up in the form of a verse. It's going to be inside a verse, but far and few between whole songs. There's songs that start off and they sound like they're going somewhere. I mentioned on Once Again, Long Island, Paz, Plug One, starts talking about his journey into fame and having it and seeing it wax and wane and how frivolous fame could be. But then by the time we get to the end of the second verse and the whole third verse, he's somewhere else. The breaks, they remake, the ethos of the Curtis Blow classic, The Breaks, but without the direction. And I bring those songs up as microcosms of what you find throughout the whole album. On Pony Ride, they showcase the ability to stay on one accord on songs like the title track and Super MCs, but the songs about women seem to be the most topical. And for a 16-track album, that is not a lot of content in any significant way to hold it down. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Takes us to dimension 6, features. So features, you open this album up and in the inside jacket, you see a photo shoot of everybody who's featured on the album with the words Native Tongues. And, young me was thinking, oh, this is the new Native Tongues. They're saying all these people are now added to the Native Tongues. They're coming back. And, since then I've heard such conflicting reports about who is officially considered Native Tongues and not. For all intents and purposes, this album serves to introduce a few rappers. Truth Inola is on here twice. He has a talking part on one song, and then he's featured with a verse on Pony Ride. The biggest introduction here to the masses is Mos Def. Now, Mos Def was in a group prior to this, the Urban Thermodynamics, and that had turned to Medina Green. Here's where he makes his debut as Mos Def. The same year that he also made his debut singing a hook on the Bush Babies, the love song, who in this jacket, the Bush Babies are included as being like this new native tongues wave. And so is Common. And this is Common, who we just did an episode on. This is Common between Resurrection and One Day It All Makes Sense. So you're getting a much calmer Common with all the great stuff that made him an underground staple for the rest of the 90s. And to be honest, this song was part of what brought him back to the platform where people were saying his name again, because he was a very prominent feature. This was a big single for the group. This is a big single for this album, and his verse was a standout verse. So as with all features, the question is, do the features help or hurt this album? But you have Truth Inola, who, you can look at where this album, positioned Truth Inola and where this album positioned Mos Def, and then ask yourself if what they brought to the albums were on equal levels. Janae also appears on this album singing the hook on For More, and the Jazzy Fat Nasty sing the hook on Baby, 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 Ooh Baby. And that's about all you get, unless you count skits as far as direct rap features. And you could argue that each rap performance that's a guest here adds something to the album. Common having the most standout feature here, because Mos Def spends a lot of his time on his feature rapping other people's raps, which is something that you are going to hear prominently throughout this album anyway. We'll talk about that in the next category, in the next video. A lot of homage to old school rap, which is ironic because at this point a lot of people consider De La Soul themselves to be old school rap, and I think they were fighting against that. I think, again, Paz accepting and fighting it, Trugoy accepting it all the way. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Do you think the features help this album or hurt this album? Which takes us to Dimension 7, the question of, does the weakest song, or do the weakest songs on this album bring it down? 16 songs on any album, you run the risk of that effect, where some of the songs are going to feel like they chip away at the masterpiece effect of this album. And so without any nostalgia, this album standing alone as a body of work, the question is, those songs that I mentioned earlier that might have been more subdued, more simplified, less inspired, do they begin to create weight for this album? And that's a question, only you would decide, which is why, you're being asked to contribute your score. But, it's evident. I do think that, there's a good chunk. There's a good chunk. Pony Ride kind of has this feeling at the end where that sample isn't a super strong sample. Sunshine, is a weird transition that happens from that soul sample that comes in the beginning and it goes somewhere very unexpected. Like, ooh, a whole song of this, coupled with the fact that they're not really saying anything new, and this is how the album ends out and rounds out. They're not saying anything on the album that hasn't already been said to the nth degree. If you're not a fan of songs where they're talking about women, like Better Listen and For More, if you get tired of the boom bap by the time you get to Once Again Long Island or Down Syndrome, then these are all things to consider and rank on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Does the weakest song take away? Do the weakest songs take away? Dimension 8, Mass Appeal. Drawing such a hard line in the sand, similar to what we mentioned when we were talking about West Side Connection's album, it brings with it the risk of leaving out a whole percentage of an audience. So De La taking this anti-this and this everyman stance also meant that they were taking themselves out of the running for, long time daytime airplay and radio darling status. Ironically, in New York, on New York radio, the #1 station at the time, Hot 97, It's So Easy got played a lot, but that also had a lot to do with the video. And the video, one of my favorite videos of all time, because it had a lot of cameos. Some of those cameos being radio personalities and people who had, some influence in that world. So it got rotation. Stakes is High got minimal rotation, became an underground classic. Business became an underground classic. It got radio play. All three of these songs got decent radio play. Stakes is High maybe being the shortest lived, because I don't think formats knew what to do with a song that sounded like that. Yo MTV Raps started using that beat, the hook part, for their in and out station identification in between videos. But I don't know if De La ever saw any money off of that. So, they launched the careers and they launched the trajectory of Mos Def, Jay Dilla into more prominence, and same thing with Common, more prominence. But they kind of get left behind. I don't think this album charted very high. And even though they got 3 singles, 4 if you count 4 more, they only got 2 videos out of this album. The woes with their label, Tommy Boy, were more evident than ever. It's just amazing that, all of the Native Tongue members were in these terrible record deal situations, and they were coming to a head at this point in the 90s. And the divide started being very evident between who was making money in rap and who wasn't. The songs towards women almost seem kind of like contrived, and you could argue you don't know if De La's fans or the regular buying audience were ready to listen to De La rap about getting girls, even though they had jammed to them rapping about getting girls for albums prior. It's just the way they were doing it. It was more direct now. I think people were used to Buddy and Saturdays, where those were more like, let's go on a date. These guys are talking about taking women to bed now. And they were always talking about taking women to bed, but I don't know. Most of these singles were unconventional. Stakes is High didn't even have a sing-along hook. A lot of the hooks on here were in the vein of old school hooks from the 80s, like even like Cold Crush, Wild Style era type hooks, where they were, similar to what Common did on Resurrection. We were talking about he ran out of ideas. He didn't really have ideas on how to make hooks, so he would just be like 1, 2, y'all, rock, y'all. That's how a lot of the De La hooks were on this album, making themselves sound older than they were, unfortunately, even though I'm sure in their minds they felt like they were paying homage. They shined the most where they were doing kind of sing-songy hooks like It's So Easy, where it's easier to run, and memorize and vibe to, or where they just let the sample do the hook for them. Because then your less inspired hooks, like the breaks and Then and It, and even the hook on Sunshine, it's like, okay, so something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, the mass appeal. How far was this album ever going to go in 1996? And, even now. So, everybody's favorite dimension 9, the 3 I's: impact, innovation, influence. The impact of this album, it was critically acclaimed. It was a journalist's darling. It was the shining member in the Native Tongues family that year, because Tribe Called Quest's album also came out. And this album ranked a little higher than that album by all journalism trade accounts. Now, what did that do for their units moved? Not much. This album never made it past number 13 on the Billboard. Again, I said it only got 2 videos, but 4 singles, 3 official, 1, unofficial. And what the influence was, there's an article out there that talks about how this album dropped the same day as it was written by Nas, and that marked the divide in hip hop. So, In our West Side Connection episode, we were talking about the East Coast and West Coast division, but within rap in 1996, there also began to be the loudest clamor, louder than ever at that point now, of the anti-commercialism, which took a turn from being, okay, this is all of us, this is real hip hop versus Vanilla Ice and Young MC and you know, MC Hammer type hip hop, to now being, oh, now that gangster rap and commercialism have joined in matrimony, it's all of us, real MCs against that, against the machine. And De La were the loudest voice and spearheading this movement. And this opened the doors for the Raucous and, you know, Stone's Throw and all the other, you know, underground movements that came and created a real backpack scene. Before, you know, maybe you just wore a backpack because you were a college student. Now this became a statement. There was a whole movement. The division is there. So, you know, I think it's interesting that they put those two albums against each other just because they came out the same day. But in my life, for sure, it represented a schism, because there was that whole summer where I was bumping nothing but It Was Written, and then by fall, I stopped and asked myself, what am I doing? I don't even know what Nas is talking about on his album. I still don't know what Nas is talking about on a lot of that album. And I can't relate to that, but I could relate to what De La was talking about to a degree. And as an older person now, you know, as a grown-up, I see that both albums had levels of abstraction. They just were all over the place. But the promise that De La was delivering was, you don't have to be this self-destructive gangster, or you don't have to pretend to be another race and live out these movie fantasies. And that struck more of a grounded chord. And I'm sure that's what happened to this whole underground wave. They found a kindred element in that sentiment. The backlash of that is that they earn the title of being seen as haters, as being disgruntled has-been rappers. And, you know, by making these pot shots and taking this antagonistic stance, they also open themselves up for retaliatory comments. And I think when you heard the Jiggy era rappers make retorts, these are the rappers they had in their mind. It was, you know, De La's, the J. Rules, the Roots, and we'll talk about all of them as we go through albums. But De La set the first resounding shot off because the album came out in the summer. And there's an article that talks about this album, and they put it perfectly, where the writer says, they don't sound like the angry forefathers, like your Melly Mel's and Grandmaster Caz's. They sound like the disappointed dads. And I was like, there you go. So influence-wise, I think that sparked a revolution, or at least that became the voice for this revolution that was bubbling under, created a civil war inside of a hip-hop period that was already looking at coastal division. Really interesting stuff. Innovation, introducing a new sound by J Dilla, introducing J Dilla to a lot more ears, and, you know, just some of the things that were being said were innovative, but that's about as far as we go there. But definitely impact and influence, something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, takes us to the final dimension, dimension 10, the overall uniqueness, timelessness, and creativity of this album. There's always some element of creativity when we're talking about De La Soul. The skits are, you know, off color. They come in, no one's expecting these kind of skits. They don't necessarily fit to the song that just went off or started. It's just in there because it wouldn't be a De La album at that point without skits. Introducing, you know, these people that they introduce, the new turn for their sound and their tone. But as an overall timeless classic outside of nostalgia, I'll leave that up to y'all to really make the decision on. I'd say those weak points on the album might affect what you consider to be timeless. I don't know if it's this super creative body of work, but it's a great return for a legendary group, and it helped them stay relevant in a time where they could have easily been written off as the hippies, the hip hop hippies. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That concludes our category 1 review of the album from 1996, Stakes is High by De La. What a way to welcome back this group, earning their masters back from Tommy Boy Records, having full control of their music. Shout out to y'all if y'all never streamed it during this whole time. They're back, they had their freedom, and it's a great way for us to set off episode 12. That's why we jumped into it, to contrast with the West Side Connection and to celebrate the brothers getting their rights back. Shout out to De La Soul, shout out to the whole Native Tongues. Y'all know what it is. Until next time, F a Rap Critic. Talk about it while I live it. Word to meth.